Struggling. Single dad gives leftovers to lonely old woman. She leaves him a vineyard in her will. He thought she was just a tired old woman on a park bench. He had no idea she once ran one of the most prestigious vineyards in Napa Valley, or that a simple act of kindness would change his entire life. When Mason Burke handed her a bag of leftovers after a long shift, he didn't expect a conversation. He certainly didn't expect an inheritance. But buried beneath her loneliness was a legacy of love, loss, and a vineyard waiting for a second chance. If you believe in unexpected blessings, second chances, and the kind of love that grows where no one's looking, you won't want to miss this story. The wind that afternoon had a bite to it, the kind that whips through thin jackets and reminds you how close winter really is. Mason Burke pulled his cap lower and tucked his hands into his coat pockets. The warm plastic container pressed to his side like it might offer more than just heat. The leftovers weren't much: half a meatloaf sandwich, 2 biscuits, and a scoop of mashed potatoes wrapped in foil. But they were more than he could afford to waste. He planned to split it with Cody later. That is, until he saw her, sitting alone on a crooked bench near the library, shoulders hunched, scarf loose around her neck. She looked like someone the world had quietly forgotten. Her eyes, though, they told a different story. Something in them caught him, made him stop. Without thinking, he held out the bag. "You look like you could use a warm meal," he said. She blinked up at him, surprised, then smiled, a soft, crinkled thing full of something fragile. "No one's been that kind in a long time," she murmured. And that, Mason thought as he walked home with empty hands and a full heart, should never be true for anyone. What he didn't know was that she'd remember him long after the food was gone, long after everything. Mason hadn't planned to see her again. He figured it was a one-time thing, just another stranger passing through the edges of his day. But when Saturday rolled around and Cody was off at the library's story hour, Mason found himself wandering back toward the same park. He told himself it was just to walk off the week, clear his head, maybe stretch his legs. But deep down, he was curious. He didn't know her name. He didn't even know if she'd be there. But there she was, same bench, same scarf, sitting with a paperback on her lap and a half-empty thermos by her feet. She looked up before he said anything and smiled like she'd been expecting him. "No leftovers today," she teased gently. And Mason chuckled, easing down onto the other end of the bench. They didn't talk about much at first, just the weather, the cost of gas, how the town's Christmas lights were already strung up too early. She told him her name was Eleanor, just Eleanor, like it was all anyone needed to know. Her voice was soft, refined, with the kind of calm that made you lean in closer to hear it all. There was something about her presence, too quietly confident, like she'd lived more than most and didn't feel the need to prove it. Mason found himself talking more than he expected. About the diner, about Cody, about how he used to dream of culinary school, but life had other plans. Eleanor listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, sipping from her thermos. When he asked what she used to do, she paused for a long time, then said, "I used to run a vineyard," like it was something she'd buried years ago. The word stuck with him long after he left. Vineyard. It wasn't what he'd expected. He thought maybe she'd worked retail, or in a school, or had been one of those quiet librarians with secrets. But a vineyard? That sounded like legacy, like land and labor and love all braided together into something people toasted at weddings. When Mason mentioned it to Cody that night, the boy's eyes lit up like stars. A real vineyard, like with grapes and everything. Mason nodded, unsure what else to say. "You think she'll tell you more?" Cody asked. "Maybe," Mason replied. But something in him wasn't sure. People don't just give away those kinds of stories. They hold on to them. They carry them like heirlooms wrapped in old grief. The visits became routine. Every Saturday after story hour, Mason would swing by with coffee or soup in a to-go cup, and Eleanor would be waiting. Some days they talked, Some days they didn't. But over time, the edges of her life started to reveal themselves. She spoke of a husband named Walter, long gone now, and summers that smelled of crushed grapes and fresh rain. She described a porch that overlooked endless rows of vines, and a tasting room filled with laughter that eventually turned to silence. "It's still there," she said once, voice trailing like smoke. "But it's not mine anymore." Not really. Mason wanted to ask what she meant, but didn't. Some stories need to come out on their own. One Saturday, the bench was empty. No Eleanor. No thermos. Just wine rustling the leaves and a silence that felt too heavy. Mason waited an hour, then left. Worry coiled in his chest like a fist. She didn't show the next week either, or the week after that. Then came the letter. It arrived in a cream-colored envelope, thick and formal, addressed in careful handwriting. Inside was a short note from a lawyer. Eleanor Fields had passed away quietly in her sleep. No children, no next of kin, but one very specific request. Her estate, including a fully deeded vineyard in the Napa foothills, was to be given to Mason Burke, the man who gave her warmth when the world had gone cold, the man who remembered her when everyone else had forgotten. Mason sat at the kitchen table that night, Cody asleep in the next room, letter shaking in his hands. "A vineyard," he whispered to no one. "She gave us a vineyard, and somewhere, deep in the quiet, he swore he could still hear her voice. It's yours now. Don't let it die." The vineyard didn't look like a dream. It looked like a ruin. When Mason and Cody first stepped through the rusted gate of Fields' estate, it was under a gray sky that made the world feel heavier. The long gravel drive was cracked and choked with weeds, and the tasting room had a busted window boarded up with plywood. Vines stretched out in every direction, tangled and overgrown, like they hadn't seen proper care in years. It didn't smell like wine or romance or history. It smelled like wet earth, mold, and the dust of forgotten things. Cody held Mason's hand tighter than usual. "Are you sure this is it?" "Dad." Mason exhaled slowly. "Yeah, this is it." It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a challenge. They started small. Clean up first, clearing debris, boarding up broken glass, and hauling trash out of the barn that had once been used for equipment. Mason worked long hours at the diner and came straight here after closing. Sometimes with Cody, sometimes alone. He didn't know anything about vineyards, but he knew how to work. He knew how to show up every day and push through when his body begged him to quit. He watched online videos, read old manuals, and took notes in a weather-beaten spiral notebook. At night, Cody would draw in the margins, clusters of grapes, tractors, even stick figures pruning vines. They had no money for hired help, just determination and a name scribbled on a title deed that somehow still didn't feel real. The neighbors were skeptical. Some drove by slow, windows down, peering out like tourists in their own town. A few even stopped to ask questions, their voices polite but edged with doubt. "You related to Eleanor? You buying or flipping? You sure you know what you're doing?" Mason answered all of them the same way, with a quiet smile and a promise he hadn't quite figured out how to keep. "We're trying to bring it back." Only one man, older and sharp-eyed, nodded and said, "You bring it back, right, son? And this valley will remember your name." One evening, after a long day clearing dead vines, Mason found a box in the cellar. It was labeled simply E and covered in dust thick enough to write in. Inside were letters, receipts, hand-drawn vineyard maps, and journals, Eleanor's, from decades ago. He sat on the cold cement floor and read until the sun went down. Her words were meticulous, practical, but there was warmth in them too. Notes about harvest yields, frost dates, and her husband's favorite wine glass. Margins filled with doodles of grapes and stars. And in one letter, written after Walter passed, she wrote, "The vines are quiet now, but they remember love." "I think I do too." Mason wiped his eyes and folded the letter back gently. She hadn't just left him a vineyard, she'd left him a roadmap. The next morning, Mason called in late to the diner. Instead of bussing tables, he stood in the middle of the vineyard with Cody and said, "We're going to do this. For real." Cody nodded like he'd been waiting to hear those words for weeks. They picked one row of vines and began pruning. Just one, but it was enough. Enough to feel like maybe, just maybe, something was coming back to life. Mason didn't know if they'd ever bottle a single drop. He didn't know how taxes worked on inherited land or if the old barrels in the barn were still usable. But he knew this. He wasn't going to let Eleanor's story end in weeds and silence. Not while he still had hands to work and a kid who believed in him. Not while the vines still remembered. Spring came slow and stubborn that year. Rain soaked the valley in thick waves, making everything heavier. Boots, tools, even hope. But the vines didn't care. They woke up anyway. Little green shoots pushed through the trimmed stems like stubborn whispers of life, refusing to stay quiet. Mason stood at the edge of the vineyard one morning, coffee in hand, watching the sun stretch across the rows like it remembered how, for the first time in a long time, he felt something shift inside. Not a miracle. Not yet. But the beginning of one. Cody came running up the path, breathless and muddy from digging near the barn. "Dad?" He called. "I found something." What Cody had found was a rusted old sign, buried beneath a tarp and two broken crates. When they cleaned it off, the metal revealed a faded logo and raised gold lettering. Fields and Son Vineyards, Est. 1957. Mason traced the words with a callous thumb, heart catching on the word son. Eleanor had no children, no heirs, but she had chosen him and Cody anyway. "Let's hang it up," Cody said with the certainty only a child can carry. "Worthy and Son now." Mason smiled, and for the first time, believed it might be true. It was around that time that help began to arrive. Not because Mason asked, but because people started to notice old Mr. Barris, who once ran a vineyard 2 hills over, showed up with pruning shears and quiet wisdom. "You're cutting too shallow," he said one day without greeting, nodding at the vines. "Grapes won't trust you that way." He didn't stay long, but he came back the next week. And the week after that, a few younger folks followed, Ella from the post office, who knew how to balance acidity from her grandfather's recipes, and Jorge, whose uncle once barreled award-winning Cabernets. It wasn't a crew, not really, but it was becoming a team. And every time Mason opened the cellar door, it felt less like trespassing and more like returning. Evenings became sacred. After the last row was worked, they'd gather around an old picnic table near the barn, sometimes just Mason and Cody, sometimes with the others. They'd eat sandwiches or leftover chili and talk about things that had nothing to do with vineyards, movies, dogs, baseball, the neighbor's ridiculous garden gnome collection. Cody would tell stories so wild and imaginative, they'd have everyone laughing. And Mason would watch him like he was catching sunlight in a jar. It wasn't just a vineyard that was growing. It was something deeper. A rhythm, a home. Still, the doubt crept in. Bills piled up like weeds. Repairs needed more than duct tape and second-hand nails. Mason had maxed out his credit just keeping the place upright. The savings he'd scraped together from the diner shifts was nearly gone. And wine, real wine, was months, maybe years away. One evening, after Cody had gone to bed, Mason sat on the porch with the ledger open in his lap and worry pressed hard against his ribs. He thought of selling just a small plot, just enough to breathe. But when he looked out across the rows bathed in moonlight, something inside him hardened. This wasn't just land. It was Eleanor's story. His story. Cody's future. It wasn't for sale. That same week, a woman in a crisp blazer pulled up to the gate in a Mercedes. She introduced herself as Lauren Crane. From Everhart Estates, a luxury development company. "We've been watching this property," she said. "Businesslike but polite. You're sitting on potential worth millions. Ever considered a buyout? Mason didn't even let her finish the brochure pitch. It's not for sale, he said firmly. We're growing something here. She smiled like she didn't believe him and left her card anyway. He tossed it before she hit the main road. The following day, Mason posted a photo online. Just one. Cody standing between two vines, hands on his hips like a tiny foreman. With a sign in the background that read, Fields and Son, the caption read, We're not winemakers. Not yet. But we're trying, one vine at a time. It didn't go viral, but it reached people, locals, friends, even a couple wine farms. Messages started trickling in. Encouragement, offers to visit, stories of how Eleanor once poured the best Merlot in the valley. Mason didn't know if any of it would amount to anything. But the vines were waking. The valley was watching. And for the first time in years, Mason wasn't just surviving, he was building. A vineyard, a legacy, a life. Harvest came faster than anyone expected. One day it was still summer, with dust kicking up along the rows and Cody running barefoot between vines. And then suddenly, the mornings were cool, the sky sharper, and the grapes hung heavy and full, their skins dark and ready. Mason stood at the edge of the vineyard, staring at what they'd managed to coax from the land. And for the first time, he allowed himself a flicker of pride. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't. There were patchy rows, uneven growth, and barrels still to be patched, but it was real. This was a vineyard again, alive, breathing, and somehow still telling Eleanor's story. They didn't have a big team, just a ragtag group of helpers who believed in what they were building. Jorge brought his cousin and two friends from a nearby farm. Ella recruited a few high schoolers who needed community service hours. Even Mr. Barris showed up in a wide-brimmed hat, barking orders with more energy than anyone else. They worked in shifts, hands stained purple, arms sore, laughter rising through the vines like a hymn. Cody insisted on making Harvest Day badges for everyone using cardboard and a hole punch. They wore them like medals. No one cared that they weren't professionals. They were a family now. The first crush happened in the old barn, just like Eleanor's journals described. They laid down tarps, brought out the salvage press from the cellar, and turned on an old radio for background noise. The grapes were sorted, cleaned, and fed into the press by hand. It was sticky, messy, and nothing short of magic. When the juice finally poured out, deep and red and sweet with potential, Mason felt something twist in his chest. Hope, fear, gratitude. He looked around at the people who'd come to help, some covered in grape skins, others raising plastic cups for a first taste. It wasn't wine yet, but it was theirs. That night, after the final buckets were dumped and the barn swept clean, they held a bonfire by the edge of the vines. Someone brought chili. Ella played a guitar she swore hadn't been tuned since college. Cody fell asleep in Mason's lap halfway through a story he was telling about a grape named Sir Raisin. The fire crackled, and stars blinked overhead like they'd come out just to witness the moment. Mason leaned back, arms around his son, and let the warmth of it all settle deep in his bones. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. Bills, setbacks, maybe a frost, but tonight, they had this, and it was enough. But peace doesn't linger without chaos. A week later, a letter arrived, stamped with official seals and the cold weight of legal terms. The county was conducting a surprise assessment, something about zoning, historic land use, and a pending development application in the area. Mason didn't need the details to know what it meant. Someone had pulled strings. Maybe it was Lauren Crane. Maybe someone else who saw this place not as a story, but as acreage. He felt the old panic creeping in. What if this was all too good to last? He spent 2 nights reading every document Eleanor left behind. Deeds, tax forms, handwritten notes. And then, in a folder taped to the bottom of an old cabinet, he found it, a clause in a land grant dating back decades, tied to conservation status. If the vineyard remained active and community engaged, the land couldn't be sold, divided, or rezoned. It was a gift from a time when legacy mattered more than luxury homes or golf courses. Mason exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. It wouldn't be easy, but the vineyard was protected if they kept it alive. So he doubled down, started offering tours to school kids, hosted a small farmer's market in the gravel lot, launched a Friends of the Vineyard Club with 5 monthly donations. Cody helped design the flyers. And slowly, support grew. Locals who hadn't set foot on the field's land in years began returning, drawn by something more than wine. They came for the story, for the roots. By the end of the season, the first bottles were ready to barrel. Mason held one in his hand, turning it over. The label printed with simple script, Fields and Son, First Harvest. He stood in the cellar, surrounded by rows of filled glass, and whispered a thank you into the silence. To Eleanor, to the land, to the choice he almost didn't make. He didn't know what the next season would bring. But he knew one thing for sure, this place was no longer forgotten. It was growing, and so was he. Winter came soft and early that year, blanketing the hills of the vineyard in a thin layer of frost that made every row shimmer like glass in the morning light. Most of the vines had gone dormant, their leaves curled and fallen, leaving only the sturdy, bare branches that had once held the weight of a season's work. Mason stood at the top of the slope, scarf pulled tight, watching the land breathe in silence. There was a calm to it, a kind of resting strength. After the harvest rush, the cold felt like a reset button. Even the cellar below had taken on a new quiet, lined with barrels now resting in the cool dark, aging towards something greater. Cody had taken to calling it wine hibernation and insisted they whisper whenever they walked by the barrels, as if talking too loud might wake the wine up too soon. He had taken ownership of the place in ways Mason hadn't expected. Every Saturday, he'd do inventory in a spiral notebook, counting corks, labeling bins, and drawing elaborate labels for future bottles. He talked about saving money to build a tasting deck, one with a swing for kids and a telescope for stargazing. Wine is for adults, he said one evening, but stories are for everybody. Mason nodded, heart full. The vineyard was becoming more than a second chance. It was becoming a dream passed from one hand to the next. The first snowfall arrived just before Christmas, and with it came unexpected visitors. Former vineyard workers who once pruned Eleanor's vines decades ago stopped by with stories and advice. A woman from the local college brought students to study the soil. Even a small-town news outlet ran a feature about the rebirth of Fields and Son, calling Mason the reluctant vintner with a diner's heart. He laughed at that headline, but the attention brought something else with it: pressure. Orders started coming in faster than they could fill. Wine shops were calling. Restaurants wanted exclusive rights. Mason was grateful, but overwhelmed. He was still learning, still building, and part of him feared what came next. It was during one of those long winter nights, after Cody had gone to bed, that Mason sat at this kitchen table and finally opened the last journal Eleanor had left behind. It was thinner than the others, wrapped in green leather, with the words Legacy Notes embossed on the cover. Inside were pages not just about wine, but about regrets, about mistakes made, land nearly lost, and the isolation that came from guarding too many secrets. On the last page, she had written, "If you're reading this, I hope you've made this place a home again. I hope you're not afraid to ask for help. Wine is meant to be shared, not carried alone." Mason closed the book slowly, as if sealing a promise. The next morning, he made a call, not to a bank or a developer, but to his old friend Dean from the diner, a man who'd once managed a supply chain job before flipping pancakes became his piece. "I need someone who can handle orders, tracking, logistics," Mason said. "I don't want to grow too fast and lose what makes this place what it is." Dean showed up with a laptop and a folder full of ideas. Within a week, He had organized everything, from delivery schedules to distribution goals. Mason still handled the vineyard, but now he wasn't doing it alone. By late January, they launched a winter tasting event, small, local, and personal. They opened the barn doors, lit up old string lights, and served soup, bread, and the first barrel-aged samples. People came, even in the snow. They wore scarves and boots and drank from mason jars. Someone played a fiddle. Someone else brought a tray of cookies shaped like grapes. It wasn't fancy, but it was alive. At the end of the night, Mason stood in the doorway of the barn, Cody asleep against his shoulder, and watched as neighbors laughed beneath the frost-covered trees. The fire pits crackled, music drifted, and the vines, even in sleep, stood tall around them like guardians of something sacred. Mason had once thought kindness was something small, like handing over a bag of leftovers. But standing there, with the world he'd helped rebuild glowing around him, he understood something deeper. Kindness doesn't stay small. It roots, it climbs, and when given the right care, it grows into something stronger than luck, louder than fear, and more lasting than even the finest bottle of wine. This vineyard wasn't just Eleanor's gift. It was her faith, and now it was his turn to pass it on. As spring rolled back across the valley, the vineyard stirred again, rose greening with new life, buds breaking through, and the air thick with the scent of turned soil and possibility. Mason woke earlier now, often with the sun, and walked the vines in silence before the day began. There was something sacred about those quiet moments, just him and the land, like a whispered conversation between past and future. The vines had survived their first winter under new hands. Now they were ready to grow again. And so was he. That season brought more visitors, not buyers or developers, but people, families. Locals who once passed the gate without a second glance now stopped to say hello, ask about the grapes, bring pies or hand-me-down tools. Cody gave many tours, pointing out his row and explaining to anyone who would listen why the soil on the east side was grape-friendlier. Mason couldn't stop the smile that grew every time his son spoke with that kind of pride. This place, once empty and silent, now echoed with laughter, footsteps, and stories unfolding in real time. One afternoon, as the vines cast long shadows in the golden hour, a car pulled up, a deep blue vintage Cadillac that gleamed like it had just rolled out of another decade. Mason wiped his hands on a towel and stepped out to greet whoever it was, expecting a wine tourist or curious neighbor. Instead, an older woman with silver hair stepped out, her eyes hidden behind large sunglasses. "You don't know me," she said before he could speak, "but I knew Eleanor. I grew up here, back when this place was more dream than business. I heard what you've done." She paused, removing her glasses, revealing eyes as sharp as glass and just as fragile. She would be proud. They walked the rows together, slowly, quietly, until the woman stopped at a vine and touched it gently. "This one," she whispered. "This was Walter's favorite. Said it always tasted like summer." She turned to Mason. "I came to see if the story was true." "It is. Thank you for not letting it die." Before she left, she handed him an envelope, a note with a short message and a small check. For the next harvest, it read. Mason didn't look at the number until she drove away. It was more than he expected. More than enough to get them through another year. That night, sitting on the porch with Cody curled beside him, Mason read Eleanor's last journal entry one more time. Her handwriting wavered near the end, but the words were clear. If this land finds the right hands, it will give more than wine. It will give purpose. It will give roots. He looked out at the vineyard, lit softly by the porch light. Still, proud, waiting. Mason had thought he was saving this place, but the truth was, it had saved him first. And maybe now, just maybe, it was ready to do the same for others. The first bottle was opened on a warm summer night, not in a fancy tasting room, But out back under the string lights, Cody had helped hang between two old posts. Friends gathered around folding tables. Plates stacked with potluck casseroles and cornbread. Laughter rolling across the rows like music. Mason held the bottle for a moment before uncorking it, letting the weight of the moment settle in. The label read simply, Fields and Son, Legacy Blend. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. As the wine poured into mismatched glasses and paper cups, stories began to rise about Eleanor. About that first rainy day on the bench. About the little boy who once thought vines were just tangled weeds. Mason listened, heart full, the firelight reflecting in his son's eyes. He realized then it had never just been about the wine. It was about community, about kindness passed forward, about a single act of generosity that became the root of something lasting. When the fire burned low and the stars blinked awake above the hills, Mason stood, raised his glass, and spoke softly. To Eleanor, to second chances, and to growing something beautiful, even when you have no idea how it'll turn out. The crowd raised their glasses, the vineyard behind them glowing faintly in the dark. In that moment, surrounded by love, legacy, and a future still unfolding, Mason understood this was no longer just a vineyard. It was home. Sometimes, the biggest miracles come from the smallest choices, a warm meal handed to a stranger, a decision to stay instead of walk away, a quiet belief that something broken can still grow. Mason didn't set out to change his life. He just chose kindness when no one else was watching. And that one act sparked a chain of grace, connection, and healing that gave not only him, but an entire community something to believe in again. This story isn't just about wine or land. It's about roots, the ones we plant through compassion, through second chances, through the love we give even when we think we have nothing left. Life doesn't always give us perfect starts, but it gives us people, moments, and choices that can rewrite everything. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of goodness, of legacy, of starting over, then help us share it. Comment below with your favorite moment. Share it with someone who believes in second chances. And hit that follow button. Because we've all got more stories coming that just might remind you of what still matters most. Love, family, and the everyday miracles hiding in plain sight.